Alright, hey y'all. So here we go into, we continue on Ahmed's Differences That Matter here with Chapter 4. So this one is called Subjects, and it's interesting because there are many things to say about what a subject is, how subjects came into fruition, and what it means to be a subject, if we can say any such thing. So she begins the chapter by stating that if postmodernism is, as Lyotard argues, a crisis of legitimation, then that crisis has been most consistently expressed as a crisis of the founding subject of modernity. So we see in this moment, at least when we think about postmodernism, there is something of a death of the subject, or thinking about the death of the author. So what does it mean for there to be some kind of originary type creator, at the level of the human? And what does that mean in relation to postmodernism, where there has been a call for the dissipation of this thing called subjectivity to some extent? So this sort of death comes into, perhaps death isn't the right way to put it, and Ahmed is clear about that, where she states that if postmodernism signals a shift from a model of the subject as disembodied, unified, and rational, and towards the model of the subject as textual, contradictory, and in process, then surely postmodernism and feminism have more than something in common. Doesn't feminism's critique of the modern rational subject as predicated on masculinity mean that feminism is part of this general postmodern onslaught, to which she will surely problematize this sort of association between postmodernism and feminism? So in order to get to this, Ahmed sort of detours through Lacan. So Lacan's psychoanalysis, thinking about the relationship that has had, or the impact that has had in constructing a postmodern post-subject, if you will, or postmodern, post-subject. And in what way does Lacan's psychoanalysis contribute to this? So we think of Lacan's psychoanalysis, we might think of one of his lectures where he deals with the problem, or deals with the unconscious as being a linguistic structure, being very much part of the textual in that way. So we see some affinity right off the bat between how Ahmed has constructed postmodernism and Lacan's theory of psychoanalysis, or the unconscious. But in Ahmed's terms, she states that in Lacanian psychoanalysis, subjectivity is understood in terms of a primary act of identification. In the mirror stage is formative of the function of the I, the child sees itself in the mirror and misrecognizes the image as itself. So this recognition, or in a sense misrecognition, stands opposed to thinking about the cogito, thinking about Descartes or anything like that. And for Ahmed, the unity and ideality of the I is a misrecognition which, while structuring the relation of the I to others, in the forms of the projection of the ego onto others, conceals the lack that inflects its own coming into being, returning to disrupt the self, presence of the image in the discordance and alienation of the fractured body. So this isn't a body that from which this construction of the I or the self emanates. Rather, there is a reliance in part on this misrecognition, or of this mirror stage, or the existence of a certain mirror, and how that sort of contradictory nature of the self, or of the coming into being, disturbs the facile location of a self as being correlative with the transcendental body, or mind, or spirit, or whatever. So already we can start to see how Ahmed is going to position this in relation to her earlier in this book critiques of postmodernism. So for those that may have not have read up till now, or listened to the other episodes I did on this, she takes Derrida to task to some extent on claiming the same thing about the law, where Derrida says that the law is something that is contradictory, something that demands pluralism to be present, or the recognition of an inside and outside that butt up against one another and create tension. So for Ahmed, that is to some extent all well and good because it opens up certain possibilities, but it is one that ignores certain textual or contextual um, uh, locations within or contextual situations that affect certain people. So this all comes down to Ahmed's recognition in Lacan that the unconscious is a linguistic device. So if we, in her words here, the subject is then instituted in and by a signifier. And insofar as there's something to be said about the psyche's relationship to a certain linguistic model, or always already being embedded within that, we may understand the whole system of society itself being affected by the same thing. So Ahmed then takes the time to think about the relationship between psychology and sociology, two things that have kind of historically stood opposed to one another, hence there being two different departments, like all in every university. But in many ways, these things for Ahmed really come together at this point when we think about this in terms, think about the psyche or people or subjects in terms of textuality. So when, in her terms, she says, it is this opening out of psychoanalysis to an understanding of the social, which has the function of a trace, which resists the mapping of the psyche as such, which may enable psychoanalysis to avoid fetishizing the signifier, the subject, through a discourse on its lack. Now, if we think of the giant enterprise, and I'll take a moment here to think about this in Marcusean terms, there is something present, at least if we take a step away from the psychological domain or the psyche and think about the social, or how the psyche has been viewed upon the social. How Marcuse looks at it, to really digress here, is that people are under the gaze of advanced capital forced into a sort of subversion or subservience to people that hold a certain fatherly or patriarchal type position. They can then exert a sort of authority onto that. Now this is something that Ahmed really wants to think about in terms of who that is reserved for, who such authority that is reserved for. And it is no coincidence when thinking about Lacan, Ahmed points to the way that he has something of a fascination with the phallus as being that point around which logos would develop, or these sorts of, I guess, oppressive instances or manifestations would develop. So she really wants to point to the way there is a truth discourse in Lacan, which is the truth of the phallus and the law of castration, which can be read more strongly as symptomatic of the shift from a theory of the signifier to a theory of the signified, in which the content or signified of the phallic signifier is already assured, whether or not the signified is in itself the lack of a signified. So there is a sort of biologism or sort of essentialism present, at least for Ahmed in Lacan, in his location continually or reverting back to this idea of the phallus. The phallus, however, is ultimately more complicated than that. So Ahmed invokes Butler here. So in quoting Butler or paraphrasing Butler, Ahmed states that if the relation of phallus to penis is of symbol to symbolized, then the phallus is not the penis, given that symbolization presumes the ontological difference of that which symbolizes and that which is symbolized. And she continues, indeed, the phallus must negate the penis in order to symbolize. The relation relies therefore on a determinate negation. The disconnection of the phallus and penis, despite their necessary dependence, implies that the phallus is necessarily transferable and can transfer itself from the Lacanian economy which masters its movement by sustaining the dichotomy of being/having the phallus according to the scene of castration. So even though both the phallus and the penis having some connection to one another, although both remain in the realm of signification, one that can certainly be applauded by thinkers that would align with postmodern thought as being an opening of these possibilities where the phallus doesn't necessarily need to have a connection to this thing called the penis and can then be almost democratically extended to other spheres, to other places, and how that, there is that connection to a certain power and how that can be distributed, kind of disseminated to other people. Ahmed wants us to consider, she demands that we consider how or whereby bodies themselves become sexed and become identified as having organs. So she states that such an approach would historicize the role of the phallus as the privileged mark of sexual difference, as being specific to a formation of power, and would emphasize the irreducibility of the penis as signifier of the body to the phallus as signifier of a metaphysics of presence, as well as their contingent relatedness. Now, what all this relies on for Ahmed is the maintenance of, be it textual or not, something of a sexual difference that has had real ramifications with regards to the subjugation of women throughout history, but anything like that, so we cannot simply disavow or we cannot ignore the effect that, or the transposition of said oppression into the realm of the textual as being, we can't simply celebrate it, that is, as being opening up a certain possibility. Rather, we have to be very cautious when we do open up these textual domains, because its dissemination or its ability to be disseminated or distributed may mark something of a, a hyper-real realization or a hyper-realization of these forms of oppression that can then thereby be distributed, globally to some extent, and can then open up some perhaps even more devastating or more oppressive schemas. So it's from this point that Ahmed thinks that, well, she moves past Lacan, stating that, there are possibilities here. There are things that we can take out of Lacan, but that at the same time, like I just mentioned, we have to be a little bit cautious. So from Lacan, she moves to Baudrillard. So when dealing with Baudrillard, she deals specifically with seduction. So for those that may not be so familiar, Seduction, it's one of Baudrillard's books, probably one of the most, that developed the most animosity towards him. He makes some clumsy mistakes in it. Notably, he spends most of the book stating that the distinction between the masculine and the feminine has nothing to do with, air quotes, biological men or women, but then continually flip-flops back and forth between the two, which is really his biggest mistake, and then is able to, well, he then says some very problematic things about both men, or mostly women. So what he does then, or what his project is despite that, is to really try to grasp the possibility of gender, of sex, as being within the realm of artifice, or with being in the realm of signification. So how do we then navigate that? Well, for him, seduction is something that is always already there. It is what guides the movement of anything by pushing it along a certain path or diverting something away from its path into something new. So for him, the masculine seduces the feminine seduces the masculine, heat seduces cold, cold seduces heat, presence seduces absence, absence seduces presence, and these things are always in flux. They're always being negotiated. Now, where he falls short is that in his attempt to craft a theory that would be heavily opposed to something called like essentialism, he does very much essentialize what woman's position is in that, what men's position in that, what the feminine or what the masculine is in relation to that. And of course, it's incredibly transphobic and everything like that. So that's to give it a little bit of context for how Ahmed here approaches it. So Ahmed quotes Baudrillard when he writes that we are in a state of sexual indetermination, where there is no more want, no more prohibitions, and no more limits. It is the loss of every referential principle. So that's really how he speaks to the postmodern condition, being loss of the real, simulation, stuff like that. But what he's speaking about here is something he develops kind of after Seduction in another text called The Transparency of Evil, or in the Fatal Strategies. He has a whole bunch of texts that deal with this kind of thing, where he is concerned about liberation broadly. He is concerned about the way in which liberation has some kind of fundamental connection to real, supposedly real bodily impulses that for him would just mark an end to illusion, an end to mystery, in favor of like an ultimate rationality under the auspices or under the guise of a benevolent progressive agenda. So then, as Ahmed says, in affirmation of what I was saying about seduction, for her, seduction is more specifically a metaphor for that which resists nature and essentialism, for artifice, appearance, and the dispersal of truth and ideology. So seduction stands opposed to the determining manifestations of history, of identity, that are indicative of broad strands of critical theory. So for him, he says that with Marxism, class is the determining factor. With psychoanalysis, the unconscious or the psyche is the determining factor. With feminism, sex or gender is the determining factor. Where for him, he says, all we can really count on is the possibility of things changing or things being brought up to the realm of signification where it is then susceptible to change, susceptible to negotiation, which is all indicative of seduction. So for him, he says that all we really have is seduction, which is kind of ironic because he's essentially just presenting a meta-narrative of history, which would stand opposed to the generally the postmodern sort of proclamation. So for Ahmed, with Baudrillard, the subject is determined by indeterminacy. That is, it is determined by this rather than class, anatomy, or gender. So in order to criticize him, she states that Baudrillard's postmodernism can be read as a normative and positive reading of the subject rather than as a rejection of its limits, a reading which refuses to recognize the determining influence of structures of power, but sees the subject as governed only by the radical free play of its own indifference, which is a very valid point. What a Baudrillardian subject would look like would be a very apathetic one in many ways. It would be a floating one that would only be able to arrive at this point if it has taken on a good deal of privilege, or it has been bestowed upon by a great deal of privilege that allows it to do that. Now this stands opposed to, say, Foucauldian subject as being that which is determined by certain conditions of the quote unquote real world. A Baudrillardian subject would be something that I guess, reading his work, it's really difficult to understand how he can ignore the effects of these sorts of institutions on creating people as subjects in that particular episteme. So it seems to be rather lazy to some extent, but in my own mind there are some important things here, but we have to be very cautious of Baudrillard. He likes to say things that without consequence and without necessarily thinking them out. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a very big fan, but we have to poke him here. We really have to call him out for his crap. And it is in Baudrillard's analysis that he suggests that the feminine is that which has privilege over the masculine, because the feminine is that which for him opposes binaries, opposes distinctions, opposes bifurcations, the facile codification of the world, and it is the masculine that has a connection to the reality, to anatomy, to class, to gender, to anything like this, precisely because it makes the world easy to understand, easy to grasp. So it's from this that Ahmed looks at Arthur Croker and David Cook's David Cook's work dealing with postmodernism, where they state that feminism is inherently postmodern because as they say, it is the quantum physics of postmodernism. So this is some sort of affinity with Baudrillard's suggestion, precisely because there is the idea that feminism, where I will kind of clumsily conflate their analysis of feminism with an analysis of the feminine, As being the quantum physics of postmodernism, it does in itself hold something of a subversive potential precisely on its location as a historically constructed entity, that is, the feminine. So in response to this, Ahmed states that they define feminism, or although they define feminism as postmodern in its notion of power as localized and its emphasis on difference, Croker and Cook also define their position against feminism, suggesting that feminism assumes sexual difference as a privileged zone of difference. Sexual difference is hence prefigured as one difference amongst many in a power grid where all ontologies are merely the sites of local catastrophes. Then she continues by saying, so here in their analysis, feminism may privilege gender by recognizing that gender itself is a privileged site of power differentiation. A feminist privileging of gender does not necessarily assume the privilege at the level of ontology, and as I've already discussed in this book, much recent feminist work has focused on the mutually constitutive relation between gender and other differences which matter, such as race and class, which is not to deny that some feminists continue to privilege sexual difference over the forms of difference. So, and it is that, and it's very much in the same way that Baudrillard is stuck in a certain mindset like Croker and Cook are. Ahmed wants to, open up doors for the differences that matter. Essentially just calling for intersectionality. And in what way does this idea of the feminine evoke the sense of, white, middle-class, straight-haired, thin, able-bodied person, and exclude or preclude those gender, racial minorities that do not fit that model. So in opposition to Baudrillard and then Croker and Cook's analyses, Ahmed suggests that her reading, that she contextualizes the process in which bodies become intelligible, understood as the mythic but material fixing of a signifier to signifiers along a vertical plane, and how that opens out the pragmatic constraints to subjects as constitutive of the social itself. So in how she's going to essentially get into that, well, she goes into it now. So she begins in the first paragraph in this section by stating that gender is hence simultaneously phantasmatic and material, an illusion of presence that marks the subject, unattainable in any ideal or integral form, but which is normative and regulative in its constitution of subjects as already sexed. So although we would do well to consider the way in which textuality plays a role in constituting subjects, there are certain material conditions, especially those grounded in power relations that perhaps aren't as material as I make them out to seem, that play a role in always making subjects out of people. So the postmodern turn suggesting that we are seeing the death of the subject, in a sense, is not allotted to certain people. So, in order to illustrate this point, Ahmed draws upon an experience that she had when she was 14, where she was walking, and I'll just say it quickly, she was walking along the street, and a police car pulls up, to which one of the two police officers asks her, hey, are you Aboriginal? Now, I believe this would have been in Australia, but I should check that. Yeah, I believe it would have been in Australia. So she said, to this question, she says no, and then the other policeman interrupted, gave her a wink and said, it's a suntan, isn't it? So in this moment, she says that from two different things, well, in her words, it seems to me now that the policeman addressed me in the first instance as working class, from dress, and as Aboriginal, from color. This identification read me as a subject by rendering me a suspect, or a danger to the law, of property, a potential robber. Here the absence of shoes becomes fetishized as an object which signifies not simply a lack of proper dress, but an improper status as somebody who does not belong to this middle class and respectable suburb. So it's in this way, and this really brings up an interesting point in opposition to, at least in my understanding, Baudrillard's reading. We're thinking about the end of a grounded subject, how that is reserved for a sort of normativity, how certain people are allowed to disappear in their surroundings, while other people are continually brought back into being, precisely by them being rendered suspect in the beautiful way she illustrates that here. And it is on that note how she considers how certain people are forced into being subjects, and despite the possibilities for this sort of postmodern ideal disappearance, they always come back into being. From this point, she moves on to her next chapter, dealing specifically with authorship. So as I mentioned in the first one, when dealing with this idea of the death of the subject, we are in a sense evoking, or we have in the back of our minds, Roland Barthes' claim that we have entered the era of the death of the author. So when we read a text, are we supposed to try and locate some fundamental truth to that text, i.e. by looking at what the intentions were of the creator, or is it always about one's own perspective? So what you come in with when you read a text is the only tools you have, the only thing at your disposal are the words themselves. So you look at it and you say, what meaning can I extract from this, from my own experience, and with the tools that I own, or that I have. Now all this is necessary for Barthes to open up the text for a plethora of possible different interpretations, so as to not limit the possibility of the text itself. Now, drawing from her earlier arguments in this book, what she says right off the bat, to sort of avoid some repetitiveness, is that the death of the author relies on a sort of masculine principle that is privileged, or that is granted the possibility of a disembodiment that is denied to many other people, notably denied to anyone who doesn't fit under the category of the middle-aged white man. So this is opposed to, well, not totally opposed, but Ahmed draws upon Foucault's text that is very much, does something of the same thing, titled What is an Author?, in which she states, or of which she states, that Foucault, although is in many ways calling for the same thing, sort of death of an authorship, she locates in Foucault, or she recognizes that Foucault focuses on the specificity of the author's name as a proper name that performs a certain classificatory function, allowing the differentiation of texts and marking off the edges of texts in a way that partakes of a mode of being. So then she quotes him, stating that the author function is therefore characteristic of the mode of existence, circulation, and functioning of certain discourses within society. So in this way, she sees a possibility with Foucault that is absent in Barthes, because it considers how the social conditions of the time, or power relations more broadly, or more specifically, that's a train noise for anyone who's curious, how those relations are always already present, and how we cannot simply just shut them out and assume that the text is that which transcends anything like that. But ultimately, Foucault's project falls short, precisely because it's not self-reflective enough, in considering even himself as being part and parcel of that privileged class, that privileged everything, except sexuality. But in what way then does even Foucault, when considering this, fall short, at least for a feminist reading? To which Ahmed evokes the work of Naomi Shore, who suggests that Foucault faces the sexual specificity of his own narrative and perspective as a male philosopher. So the refusal to enter the discourse as an empirical subject, a subject which is both sexed and European, may finally translate into a universalizing mode of discourse which negates the specificity of its own inscription as a text. So on one side of the coin, Ahmed sees the potential in getting rid of this thing called the author, because of the implications of there being this fundamental truth pertaining to any text, which can extend beyond just books or film or anything like that, where it is dealing with any sort of cultural icon in a given social framework. So she's weary about that, but then is also weary about the total disembodiment implied by the death of the author, where we are just simply taken out of context, thrown into the void of a sort of postmodern ether. And the timing of this is not unimportant either. Where these people, many of these postmodern thinkers, were writing at a time that women were starting to gain access to things that have been classically denied them, historically denied them, like the ability to write for the most part, to enter certain institutions, to enter a role, play a role in politics. At which time, postmodern thinkers came up and said, "Oh yeah, all that doesn't matter anyways. All this contributes in the, I guess, subtle oppression of all people under the guise of like this thing called truth or contextualization," which is an important thing to consider because it doesn't seem to be all that coincidental then. Now, thinking about this in terms of women entering the sphere of writing, or saying women's writing, does in itself essentialize this idea of womanhood, where it's not so simple as in putting onto this thing called writing, in the wake of the death of the author, this idea of the woman author. Because then we must question, what does this woman author necessarily look like again? Is it black woman? Is it Tina woman? Who is it that we are talking about here, let alone trans women? So this negotiation of womanhood poses an issue not simply for the essentializing notion of the author, but also the postmodern disembodied subject, because it is always a negotiation, and it almost approaches a realization at any given time where the authorship is taken upon whoever is writing, but then it often fades because there is a questioning of who that author necessarily is and whose voices are being necessarily heard. So she poses this in the form of a few questions. She says, whose life stories matter? Whose stories are authorized as such? My attempt to defend the importance of the question who is writing here, which is argued in section 1, necessitates that we shift from an analysis of the origins of writing to the context in which writing and reading take place, is an attempt to bring our attention to how writing is always implicated in a discursive relation of address which is irreducible to sexual difference. So again, it's really emphasizing how we're working in between these two things, where it's not totally sexual essentialism, nor is it totally disembodiment, but somewhere that takes from both in a sense. Now in this section, Ahmed gives many textual references that I'm not familiar with, like it really speaks to my reading choices. So I have been kind of skimming, like I've skipped over some of that, but all of her analysis is really cool, and you don't actually need to be familiar with the text itself to be able to engage with her analysis. So for those of you that haven't read it yet, like, don't be worried about that. It would certainly help if you've read these, but that's why I've been kind of, I don't want to pretend like I know, when in fact I'm not really familiar with Angela Carter all that well, like a little bit, or anything like that, because it's not I haven't gotten there yet. So for that reason, I've been kind of skipping over some stuff. So if anyone's read this and they're like, well, where's all that? Sorry, I had to, just for the sake of time as well, because to give to supply context or to supply synopses would just take so long. So it's for that reason I really jump through this chapter here, because I don't want to lie to anyone. But she ends on a good note, or a good point, where she states that it is here that the author's death, proclaimed by postmodernism as signaling its own arrival, becomes a question that is living. Where it's in how I read this, it is about how that subject is always, despite the call for its death, or a sort of requiem, it is always brought back into being. It's always being negotiated, even the terms of its disappearance, where it can always realize itself once more, and especially how Ahmed's project here, how it gives a voice to those people marginalized, so those people often forgotten about. So moving to the last chapter here, it focuses on two texts specifically, or two kind of projects broadly. One of them was by Cooper, which deals specifically with violence against women, or at least that's what Ahmed takes out of it, and well beyond that, other texts as well. But dealing specifically with Robert Coover, and his The Babysitter, which for Ahmed is a story that involves the plot of the multiple rape of a female character. Now, I've never read it, like I'm not familiar with this, but Ahmed is very clear about the way in which that it depicts violence against women in a certain way. So I want to kind of round this together, and this isn't, I misspoke, this isn't the last chapter, this is the chapter before last. I want to kind of round this, or kind of roll this over into her big discussion in the following chapter, in how she talks about David Lynch, and David Lynch's Blue Velvet, which is another film that deals, or which is a film that deals with violence against women. Now, both of these texts were for Ahmed. They were texts that were praised as being these kind of experimental, postmodern examples of the way that cinema can manifest itself. So the plots of them, without getting into them too intensely, center very much around violence against women. Whether or not it happens off camera and is just alluded to, or it very much happens, these films do rotate around these themes, which, if you can call that a theme, these events. So of these two examples, Ahmed really wonders to what extent there is something of a radical transgression happening here against modernism, against the confinements of textuality, of cinema, of literature, and she wonders what remains consistent across these different spaces. So although it might open up a politics of transgression and subversion in her words, or something of a radical politics, it is always already grounded within a certain patriarchal system that it can't ignore simply by presenting itself in a different way, taking on a different face, perhaps being more quote-unquote experimental. It is still within that sphere. So this kind of experimentation is against, and she re-evokes Leotard here, against metafictions or meta-narratives, right, that supposedly give broad historical accounts of different things, and opens up the possibility of a plethora of perspectives. So for Ahmed, postmodernism is a way of reading, hence reduces politics to literary form at the same time as it places issues such as sexual difference on the side of content. So more than these films or these texts being employed as, or created in a sort of resistance to modernism broadly, the way in which we analyze them cannot be divorced from that same, or the context in which we find ourselves. So when sexual difference is kind of relegated to the margins, or just seen as being another plot device, we forget the extent to which it operates within a greater system of oppression. So then Ahmed moves to speak specifically about some of Robert Coover's texts, which I'm like many of the other texts in this book that Ahmed evokes, I'm not familiar with enough to really feel comfortable engaging with them, and for that reason why I kind of want to move into her critique of Blue Velvet, or David Lynch's film, because I actually know about that and I could actually speak to it. But here, like, this is really could be taken much better reading it, so excuse me for skipping a bunch again, but the literary references are just, it demands you do a dissertation to grasp a lot of the stuff that Ahmed is talking about here. Just the reading list is quite intense. But before I move on, to summarize what her critique is essentially of these texts, is that while they open up, or while they present something like contradictory accounts of events that occur that could be read as, opening up the domain, opening up the possibility of different perspectives, kind of the death of the author type perspective, they all rotate around or involve a very singular real event that, or events, all in the case, or that are all acts of violence against women, which for Ahmed is not a coincidence. This is absolutely what that people would want to read about, because this internalized misogyny as being just one thing, but how that is often, as she had stated, set to the margins. It's not considered important. It's just another plot device amongst other ones. So it is from here she moves into the question of seeing. Now, how does postmodernism manifest itself on the screen? Which would be like, a theorist like Baudrillard takes this up rather intensely, but for Ahmed, she says that there is a psychoanalytic component to this, where the spectator takes on the position of like a voyeur, or takes on the position of a certain a viewing subject that then sees the screen and see themselves in the screen, or input their desires and wants onto the characters, onto the actions that they see occurring on the screen. So in the postmodern turn, even this comes to be troubled, precisely because the whole act of seeing implies a certain subjectivity, implies a certain subjecthood, and implies that there is something to be seen. Whereas, taking something like Baudrillard, for instance, who would suggest that the screen presents nothing, the screen is just indifference, Ahmed here recognizes that that is very much part and parcel of the postmodern film, or the postmodern moment of film studies. So for her, to identify the site of postmodernism as transgression is hence not to be looking at all. It is through the event of not seeing that postmodernism becomes visible in an ontology of the break, a break from realism, or from that recognition of the real. Now this is problematized with Laura Mulvey, so her article Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, when she, and this is what Ahmed draws upon with it, when Mulvey looked at the way in which there is a gaze, and the gaze cannot disappear, or the act of seeing, and in fact that gaze is very much a patriarchal one. So how do women dress, how do they act in film, and how they act and how they dress, or however, how that is not a coincidence, how they are doing it to meet a gaze that is always already present. Now the same occurs, or there is this existence of gaze, or it can be observed when we may observe something like violence against women occurring on the screen. So then Ahmed considers Blue Velvet. So she gives a little bit of a summary here. She says, the narrative of Blue Velvet centers on the discovery of a severed ear by the central male character Jeffrey. This discovery takes him on a trail of intrigue involving his eyewitnessing of rape, sadomasochism, kidnapping, as well as drug abuse and trafficking. At one level, the narrative repeats the tradition of the thriller, in which a heroic male figure seeks to find the truth and to convert a situation of disorder and violence into a scene of order and peace. And what we follow, or the way in which Ahmed frames it here, we are gazing what Jeffrey, the protagonist, is gazing. So we see what he sees. So in many ways, we are both, as the spectator and Jeffrey, on this adventure, going through this world of this kind of underbelly of nice suburban life. So what Ahmed states of this is that what is enunciated in Blue Velvet, however, is not simply a confirmation of the fetishism that sustains the conflation of women and image. The image remains irreducible to women. Blue Velvet fascinates itself with her white body, the whiteness of the body against which blue and black marks appear as signs of violence, as the threat of violence to the frailty of her white skin. So that act of viewing being not something neutral, not something occurring by a non-subject onto a non-subject, but being part of that patriarchal relation between viewer and viewed, between spectator and spectated, between male, disembodied, gazing male, and codified, determined, essentially in the form of an image of a woman. So this rendering the woman as image in this way calls us, and this is where postmodern perspective actually has some subtraction. It calls it into question the legitimacy of any sort of perspective about it. So if women are reduced to the status of image, then what is the status of the violence that we see occurring against women? Well, surely, to remain consistent in this argument, the postmodern thought would be that it was simply another image, where the violence against women is just taken up as another image. So what Ahmed says about this is that given this framing, the depiction of violence is ambiguous. There's an element of uncertainty as to whether the rape is real within the context of the filmic diegesis, and yet at the same time, the act of witnessing the violence becomes reinscribed as an act of violence. So those things that are taken for granted or are assumed to be at the level of the image or the textual, we have to question what things are reserved there, where the person gazing is almost subtly, that is Jeffrey, given or being gifted a subjectivity that stands above the things that he observes, these women, these violences against women, that simultaneously, this is somewhat ironic, disembody the women while embodying Jeffrey, where Jeffrey has a face, Jeffrey has a conscious, Jeffrey has something of a psyche that is denied to these other people in their being rendered image. So there's something of a reversal here, where the privileging was in how Ahmed kind of framed it in the postmodern moment, with the male, with the man being able to be disembodied, being able to float above everything else. Now we can locate something of an oppressive disembodiment, which would be pretty much in tune with feminist thought. Like, disembodiment isn't great, but it also reinscribes the viewer, Jeffrey, the male, as subject or as embodied. So it's interesting how we can consider this here, and it's on that note that I'll move into, moving rather quickly here, move into the conclusion. Because it makes it at times kind of difficult to get into this. Like, I understand it, absolutely, and Ahmed is really quite brilliant, but we have to also consider how disembodiment is not in and of itself bad nor good. How it can be employed, how certain people can be disembodied, how certain people can be embodied in a certain way that make it so that they can't engage in some form or other with the broader sociocultural context in which they find themselves, where men are able to float above that and say, oh, nothing matters, oh, I'm not attached to anything, I'm a rhizomatic flow of becoming or whatever, and then how other people are forced to just because they have no choice. But then on the flip side, as we see in this film, or in how Ahmed reads it, it is as though the privileging is being given that sort of embodiment, right? The ability to see, to consume others as image. So it's really fascinating, I think, how it works in that way. And it makes it more complex, which is really what I enjoy about Ahmed here. She doesn't make things easy for us, which is nice. But yeah, on that note, I'll move right into the conclusion, even though there are more filmic references that I'm not so familiar with. So really, the best thing to do would be to read it for yourselves. But on this, I'll move right into the conclusion. So she asks us to remember, in a sense, in the conclusion. So it's not something, she paints this conclusion in such a way as to not evoke the sense of an ending, but rather a remembering, where we have to consider those people, those voices, those opinions that are excluded from this broad sphere of postmodernism, despite its claim to open up the possibility for said perspectives. And this is in my own experience, this is surely the case of many academics. Like, just look at their works cited pages. It's embarrassing, the kind of echo chamber of white maleness, white cis maleness can be found in these spheres that supposedly applaud, that supposedly strive to open up the domain for more possibility. Extremely conservative. Now I'm going to get my head chewed off for this one, but I don't care. So yeah, and it's that forcing us to remember, forcing us to call attention to those parts that we exclude. That I think it's just as she ends her book on that note. I think that'd be a good place to end it here. I could fill it in with my own jargon, but it wouldn't be quite as eloquently put, because Ahmed's a very good writer, very poetic, even in this very technical stuff that she does. But yeah, for anyone that listened this far, especially if you listened to all the talks, I hope I wasn't too repetitive. I tried to avoid being repetitive, but I caught myself at times. Like, it's difficult engaging with the text on my own without getting repetitive, because I have my own echo chamber. I just want to say the same things over and over again, what I'm comfortable with. I'm trying to get out of that. But anyways, for anyone who made it this far, thanks a lot. And if you have any criticisms, you feel like I excluded anything, any differences that matter, please, you know how to leave it. But for now,